Let me introduce to you the Group CEO of AMREF Africa, Dr. Githinji Tafadhali. Karibu sana. Give him a round of applause.
Well. Thank you. Thank you, Mike. Good morning, everybody. Distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, I'm honored to have been invited here today. I work with an organization called AMREF Health Africa, and we work in all these African countries, closing the gap that exists between the formal health system and the communities. And yesterday we had a fantastic public lecture from Professor Miriam Were on how to close this gap. And Professor Miriam Were, thank you very much for that. That was fantastic. And a big hand to Professor for yesterday's public lecture, which many of us had a chance to attend. I would say that after reading a lot more about the global network of public health nursing, I am your newest member. So I went online and paid my fees and registered yesterday. So I'm a member now. Yes. So I'm speaking to you as one of you. So you can also give me the t-shirt, the bag, and the nightingale lamp. But let me confess, I didn't always love nurses, actually. Because they put many big needles into my buttocks when I was young. For one reason or the other, they put these big needles because when I was growing up, we did not have disposable syringes. So all these needles that used to boil in the charcoal jiko or the gas jiko, as you wait on the lap of your mother, and before the needle boils to sterility, you take off. And the nurse and the mother will be chasing you down the corridor. And my mother always won because I was her 8th child, she was 35. She was strong and vicious after having brought up so many children. So when I was invited to speak here on this topic of the role of public health nursing in achieving universal health coverage, those memories came back to me. And I couldn't help thinking how thankful I am to my mother and to all of you and to all the nursing profession because I'm alive today because of nurses and because of my mother. It's therefore no coincidence that Sunday was International Nurses Day and was also Mother's Day. And I felt, actually, I talked to my mother and told her about those. We had a few reflections about those days. Anyway, let's look a little about the underlying theme for this conference. The underlying theme for this conference is good life and well-being for all. As stated in SDG 3, it's about life. Life as life is born. And the best measure of life right now that we have, you can measure quality of life, you can measure all these things, but life expectancy tends to be the kind of thing that we look at to see whether people are living a good life or a long life because there is reduced premature death. And for quality of life, we tend to look at other indicators like the human capital, which the World Bank has provided us with more recently, to say if you look at individuals' quality of life, look at the way they grew up, their health experiences, their education, and therefore what is their potential as an individual by the time they get to 18 years old. And based on their experiences, all the needles in my buttocks, all the diarrhea that I may have had, the pneumonia, the malaria, the lack of food that I may have had, when you accumulate all these things and the days missed in school, they give me a human capital potential or index. And on average in Kenya, we know that by 18 years, a child has a potential of about 52%, whereas a child in Uganda has a potential of only 38%, whereas a child in Japan has a potential of 84%. So these experiences are important in looking at human life experiences about long life and also about quality of life. But today I want to focus a little more on life expectancy because the Human Capital Project and the Human Capital Index is a subject for a whole conversation. It's a subject for a keynote address in itself. The 10 countries with the highest life expectancy are non-African. None of them in the top 10 is in Africa, while the bottom 10 are all African, except Afghanistan, which is in that list. It's not always been this way, actually, because when you look at developed countries and you look at the 17th and the 18th century, the life expectancies in those countries were akin to the life expectancies that we have in Africa and in many other low-income countries in Asia. In fact, the life expectancy in Europe in the 17th century was 35 years because there was very high child and neonatal mortality, very, very high. But by 1940, it had risen to 70 years. So what was the real issue? The real issue was three things. One was plague, which is basically communicable diseases. It was violence, and it was famine. Those three things are the things that exterminated humanity. They wiped millions off the face of the earth. Millions died, and humanity watched because there's nothing we could do. And between 1692 and 1694, you can look, that's just about 2 years, France lost 15% of its population to hunger. People starving to death. Currently, most people dying of famine die because of political neglect, not because of lack of food. They die because politicians have decided they are not worth saving. We have enough food. This doesn't mean we don't have nutritional insecurity and stunting. We do. In fact, 33% of our under fives in Africa are stunted, and that accounts for about 30% or more of the global stunted population. And we can do a lot about that because that affects their human capital potential, as I said. Because stunting is one of the biggest reducers of human potential because it affects cognitive capacity. So stunting must be resolved. But for the first time today, there are more people who die of eating too much than from eating too little. There are more people who die from old age than from infectious diseases. And there are more people who commit suicide than are killed by soldiers, terrorists, or criminals. So the world has changed. In this century, an average human being is likely to die from eating fast food and sugar than from drought, Ebola, or a terrorist attack. So sugar is actually more dangerous than gunpowder in the current age. Today, the poor eat hamburgers and French fries, while the rich eat salads and quinoa seeds. In 2014, 2.1 billion people were overfed compared to 850 million who suffered malnutrition, 3 times. And this is a result of reducing poverty rates and globalization. So all these advantages come from economic growth, more education, and all these things. The next big scourge was plague, infections. And in the 13th century, during the Black Death, 4 out of 10 people died, reducing England's population from 3.7 million then to 2.2 million in a very short time. Many cities lost half their population. And until the early 20th century, about 1/3 of children died before reaching adulthood from both malnutrition and disease. However, this incidence has dropped now. The global child mortality is at an all-time low, and only 5% from the 33% I've talked about of children die before reaching childhood. And in developed countries, that's 1%. So in Africa it's higher, but in developed countries that's down to 1%. So what caused the Great Escape? There's a book written by Angus Deaton. He was the 2015 Nobel Prize winner for economics. And he wrote a book called Health, Wealth, and Inequalities. Angus Deaton. And the book is called The Great Escape. So I borrowed this verse or this phrase from Angus Deaton. And I asked, what caused the Great Escape for the developed countries to move from this pool of death to high human capital potential and to high life expectancy? It was water, sanitation, and public health. Many of you may remember the Public Health Act of the 1940s in London, when soon after that, the National Health Service was launched. It was about vaccinations and antibiotics. It was about socioeconomic growth, and it was about education. And these are all public health issues. So many years later, what has Africa learned? A lot, but not enough. And that's what I want us to talk about very quickly. If you consider the major causes of death between the high-income deaths or high-income countries and the low-income countries, especially in Africa, more than half of all deaths in low-income countries in 2015 were caused by communicable diseases, plague. Conditions arising out of pregnancy and childbirth, preventable, and nutritional deficiencies, hunger. By contrast, less than 7% of deaths in high-income countries were due to such causes, less than 10%. What's more, we've now seen reemergence of diseases that we thought were no more. But that's not only happening in Africa. America is struggling with measles. Measles in America. I'm afraid of going to America, actually. I'm waiting for a travel advisory, but I've not seen one. At the same time, though, non-communicable diseases cause 70% of the global deaths, but 78% of those global deaths in non-communicable were, again, in Africa. But Africa also suffers this problem of premature death. 5 out of 10 deaths that happen below 5 years happen below 5 years in Africa. If you look at all, you took an aggregate mortality and you looked at 10 deaths, 5 out of those 10 will be under 15 years. Whereas, if you look at that same number for Europe, you would see that only 2 out of 10 deaths die before 60. So we still got a big problem of premature death. For a mother in a rural area, in an urban slum, or living in a fragile state, in all these conflict and fragile states, or living in the slums of Kawempe, or living in the slums of Soweto, or living in the slums of Nairobi, having her desired number of children is like gambling or playing the lottery, because you're not sure which one will survive. Some may survive, some may not. Sometimes you win and sometimes you lose. That's why we still maintain a very high fertility rate, and you see that fertility rate worse in conflict states. In Africa, death takes the young. The big question is, 80 years after sanitation became a priority for England, 90 years after the discovery of penicillin, 223 years after discovery of vaccines, and after many advances in medicine, why is it that these statistics still reign? It's not about medical devices, it's not about scientific progress. It is about equity, it's about social justice, and it is about access. And that access is linked to social justice. Access that gives people the ability to prevent disease and disability, access that helps to detect and treat illnesses or other health conditions, access that increases the quality of life, and access that increases health and well-being and increases their life expectancy. So what keeps our people from accessing health? First and foremost, we need to unlearn the opinion that it's ignorance. For many years, we have said that people don't know how to access health because they're ignorant. That when a mother comes late for antenatal care, she is ignorant. That when a mother doesn't bring her child for vaccination, she is ignorant. That when a mother comes to the clinic with an underweight child, she is ignorant. Our people face many socio-economic and environmental factors, and the biggest of these is poverty. And this affects decision-making and prioritization. We can only overcome this by focusing not on supply-side health systems, but on demand-side health systems, because we can find the mothers and children where they are, and we can talk to them, and we can find and relate their conditions to the environments in which they live. In 2015, the world got together, designed the SDGs, and resolved to end poverty, hunger, to combat inequalities within and among countries, to build peaceful and just, inclusive societies, and to protect human rights, and at the same time to promote gender equality, as it is one of the biggest factors that takes away agency from half of the world's population, and the empowerment of women and girls, and to ensure that the lasting protection of the planet and its natural resources. These were the 17 SDGs, but if you look at specifically SDG 3, which is good health and well-being for all, and is the focus of this, it is seen both as a contributor to this sustainable development as well as a beneficiary. It is critical to the attainment of all these goals. And in practical terms, therefore, your theme today at this conference is not only linked to health, it is linked to the goal of reducing hunger. It is linked to improving nutrition, linked to universal access to sexual and reproductive health, linked to safe water and sanitation, energy efficiency, climate change, which is the cause of so many deaths that we see today, that without thinking about climate change will not resolve the issues of health. Sustainable production and consumption, looking at legal and regulatory frameworks about how our people consume foods. In many countries now, they have said you cannot have fast food restaurants near schools. Regulatory frameworks that actually look at safe sustainable production and consumption, civil registration, legal identity, preventing violence, and of course, to the broader goal of eliminating absolute poverty and human rights. And you can add mental health to that whole list. Under the SDG goal, number 3, in 3.8 is where we find universal health coverage. Universal health coverage was added after a lot of lobbying. That's why it is just one of the targets, rather than the overarching target of SDG 3. Within SDG 3, then you have 3.8, which is about universal health coverage. And within that, you have two elements. 3.81 talks about equity, financial protection. 3.82 talks about access to services, access to health, not to healthcare. So I want to talk about very quickly, because I've been told by Elizabeth I have only a few minutes. She's taken my time away. Financial access, access to health, and equity. While low and middle income countries spend between $30 to $85 per individual per year, and that figure is not government expenditure. That figure is total expenditure, which combines government, donors, and individuals out of pocket. Countries like the US spend in excess of $8,000 per capita, and in Europe it's about $4,000 per capita. Furthermore, what I've told you is the $80 in low-income countries, about 30% of that is out of pocket. Statistically, we can demonstrate that countries with higher health expenditure have a longer life expectancy. An increased health expenditure is achieved through better tax collection, pooling from the rich, increased budget allocation by government, and better utilization of allocated funds. Better utilization, meaning that you spend where the most are, and that is primary health care, and that is public health. In which case, therefore, financing of UHC is first and foremost about equity. It's about going to where the population is and going to those who are vulnerable first. If I had time, I would have demonstrated the difference between equity and equality. If Elizabeth allows me, I will do that later. Secondly, access. Our current model of health service delivery does not respond to our disease burden at all. As I have demonstrated earlier, communities live far from their formal health sector, both by distance and socio-culturally. You cannot underestimate the power, the energy needed by a mother to leave her farm instead of farming, to walk to the clinic for checkup, unless she cannot work and there is a threat of death or extreme pain. The key reason for this is hidden costs of healthcare, lost wages, transport, and other social costs. Priorities must be made, and that is the issue I talked about, agency, the ability to seek what you desire, or the ability to use your capabilities. If your child were hungry and you needed to buy blood pressure medicine, what would be a priority? You'd feed your child. But when the mother doesn't take and doesn't comply with medicine, we say they are ignorant. There are priorities to be made. Community health strategies help us to close this demand loop. And even from a selfish point of view, as I talk to public health nurses and nurses generally would be the biggest beneficiaries of an effective demand-side community health system. Community health workers, the whole issue of enrolled community nurses, which has been controversial. Some countries are trying to abolish it, other countries are insisting it must stay. These issues must be looked at as issues of demand loop closing. They must not be seen as competitive professional issues. They must not be seen about people competing for tasks. They must be seen as a solution to closing the demand loop. And therefore, as was said yesterday by Professor Were, nurses need to take up the issue of advocacy for government to integrate community health systems, whether they are ECNs or enrolled community nurses, or they are community health workers, to integrate them to the formal health system and to reduce the burden of delayed seeking of care on the curative services. For nurses to focus on facility-based services is to miss the big portion of the health ecosystem which contributes. So as I come to a close, let me talk about equity very quickly. That when you talk about universal health coverage, you're talking about reaching those who are behind first. You're not talking about equality. You're not talking about giving everyone the equal thing. You're talking about equity. You're talking about giving the people, if you have someone who is short and someone who is tall, and they are both watching a football match, it is not about giving both of them an equal stool. so that they see over the fence. It's about giving the stool fast to the short one so that they can actually see the match. That's equity. And that's the concept of universal health coverage. So as my time is drawing to a close, allow me to conclude with asking, what shall we do? Nurses need to be at the forefront of advocating for universal health coverage. The problem we have with universal health coverage advocacy is that everybody advocates for what is relevant to them. When I meet people who are talking about non-communicable diseases, they advocate for universal health coverage for non-communicable diseases. When I meet people who are in sexual reproductive health, that's all they advocate for. When I meet doctors and I talk to them about universal health coverage, they say it is about better pay, it's about better salary, it's about more doctors. So I'm hoping that I'm not meeting nurses who say that your advocacy for universal health coverage is about better pay for nurses, it's about more nurses in the system. Because universal health coverage, as I've talked to you about, is about equity. It's about the vulnerable first. It's about access. It's about financial protection. And within that, then, you may find that for you to close the equity gap, you may need more nurses. You may need more community health workers, indeed. You may need to review the curriculum for teaching of nurses to address the issues of vulnerability and mobile health systems, like for people in Zimbabwe and Mozambique and Malawi, where Cyclone Idai hit and they had to move from their settlements. You may need to think about universal health coverage beyond the nursing profession, and I'm urging you to do so, because so often the verticalization of universal health coverage is what is actually holding us back from success. Health systems will only work if we create robust systems for health, not for healthcare. For people, not for patients. For communities, not for particular professions or sectors. This is your role. And by so doing, we'll have addressed the primary issue of life and death, loyal to your work, and devoted towards the welfare of those committed to your care. It is within your power, and we look up to you. Thank you for inviting me. Thank you.